Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to the Social Security Clothing Allowance for Orphans and Unsupported Children Amendment Bill. Mr. Speaker, it's nice to be able to speak on such a positive bill and to be able to talk around an area that we've got broad agreement. And certainly over the last few hours we've had examples of where perhaps we don't agree on both sides of the House, and it got pretty heated there and perhaps unfortunately a little bit personal in my view. It's nice here to be able to have a conversation around a piece of legislation that by all accounts we have significant alignment on. Mr. Speaker, I do want to acknowledge Tracy Martin as everybody else has who have got up to speak on this evening. Mrs. Martin is clearly someone who has a huge passion for those people in our society who are vulnerable, and I suspect it's been quite a journey for her in terms of designing this proposed bill initially, ensuring that it reflects values that were important to her, and then of course once it gets pulled out of the ballot, going through the journey of negotiation and compromise and working with both sides of the House through introduction and then select committee, and then now back here for the second reading. So that takes tenacity. I think it also shows judgment around when to call an agreement, and so I do want to acknowledge that. Perhaps I might even say I'm slightly surprised, Mrs. Martin, that such a good idea could come from your side of the House and potentially even you, because in my experience to date, which I acknowledge in this esteemed chamber with so much experience both surrounding me here and also on the other side of the chamber, you could perhaps somewhat generously be described as a typical opposition contributor, with your sharp and frequent barbs, although it'd be fair to say your voice never fails to reach this side. And so at least audibly, we hear it up the back. We certainly do, right up there we hear it every day. But it's at least audibly reaches its target. So it audibly reaches its target if nothing else. Because we're getting very close to 10 o'clock, and I'm sure Mr. Speaker can just bear with a novice, but I was out in the Eyes lobby before talking to my son when we were two members' bills back and the passions were high, and Mrs. Martin was in full flight, if I could describe that. I'm sure we all can understand what that was like, and I was talking to my little boy on the phone. And I was trying to, talk to him about how his day was and all swimming sports, and he said, Daddy, he said, who's that lady in the back? And I said, oh, that's one of the MP. And she said, she sounds nice, is she one of us? And I said, well, yes, she is nice in a sort of broad, generic sense, and who knows if she's one of us.
I'm going to encourage the member to come back to the bill, I think.
Oh, yeah, okay, right. I will return to the bill, and thank you for your generosity, Mr. Speaker. Look, this is a fantastic bill, and as I said, it's great to be able to stand here and support it, and support Mrs. Martin, who has promoted it. And it's good to identify the inconsistency between funding for foster children and funding for unsupported children and orphans. And clearly it made no sense to have funding for a clothing allowance for one group, in this case foster parents, and not the other group. So National supports this sensible solution, as our speakers have already said, and it's aligned with our philosophy in terms of our ongoing improvement on social delivery. It's aligned to our part of our additional $10 million investment, which has been touched on before, and that of course came out of our white paper for vulnerable children and the Children's Action Plan, which I may get onto shortly. Mr. Speaker, in the context of this bill, I do actually want to acknowledge grandparents in particular who spend time looking after their grandkids. Mr. Speaker, there are some big numbers here in terms of this kin carer space in New Zealand. 12,000 New Zealand children are being cared for by wider family members because of the death of a parent or a family breakdown, and 8,600 of those who are caring for these children, half are grandparents and by and large with limited income. Look, when we think of grandparents, and you know we've all had them, and I had two very special ones, there is this sense of them being part of your lives, and you have, you know, for those of us lucky enough to have good relationships with grandparents, they step in to your life, you have a great period of time with them for a day or two, a night or two, and then you step back and you get handed back, but go back to your parents, and that's probably a relief in some cases for the grandparents, and certainly it's been a relief for the parents to have the little bit of a break. But what an extraordinary effort it is for the grandparents who, you know, as we've heard in the scenarios expressed this evening, and also, I understand, very moving scenarios that were spoken at the Select Committee, of grandparents who find themselves in a situation of needing to step forward and, I think, give a pretty much ultimate, right up there in terms of an ultimate sacrifice, and now that their own children are not in a position to care for their children, they then step in as grandparents to support. You know, in many respects, they've already done that, right? They've reached the stage where they're at the more quieter stage of their life, and no doubt have other priorities, but they give up their twilight years to help out for the family's sake and for the children's sake. That's huge personal sacrifice, and I've never met a grandparent who wouldn't put their hand up, you know, for some babysitting, but as I said, pretty pleased to be able to flop back into the chair when that's finished. But what an extraordinary commitment to be in the twilight of your life and say, you know what, I'm going to stand here and provide unconditional love day in, day out, even though my energy reserves might be low, even though, to be honest, you know, in my heart I wouldn't mind playing bowls instead, but I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be here for my children, for my children's children. So it's real hard work, and I do want to acknowledge those who do that. I've actually not played it. Have you, Mr. Bishop? I could imagine it's very popular in the hut. Yes, I suspect I will. But it is hard work, and I think we do need to acknowledge, and I'd like to acknowledge tonight those, not only grandparents but kin carers generally, who are giving up, you know, an extraordinary part of their lives to be able to provide that love and support. Mr. Speaker, we have done a lot of initiatives to be able to support this general theme, particularly around greater parenting support. My colleague Alfred Naro mentioned it earlier, but I think it is worth repeating further, that in partnership with the grandparents raising grandchildren and the Parenting Place, we've developed a tailored toolbox specifically for kin carers at a cost of $600,000 a year. I think that should be acknowledged. And in my earlier context with respect to grandparents putting their hands up at a time of life when perhaps they've not been tuned to being parents in the modern world, I think the refresher course that is being provided, providing insight to how children's early experience might be affecting them now into the future, and giving them tools to be able to be as good a parents as they possibly can be, I think again is a practical example of actually standing beside families who are needing support when this challenge arises. And this takes the form of videos, manuals and formal discussion and toolboxes, often delivered in someone else's home over 6 sessions. And clearly the feedback we've had, and I understand we got this back through the Select Committee, is this example of our supporters working very well. Other example, Mr. Speaker, and I may not be able to get to expand on it tonight, is the work we're doing in our children's teams. Obviously Rotorua and Whangarei are now well established.
Order. I regret to interrupt the member. This debate is interrupted and is set down for resumption next sitting day. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. That's just.